on plantations. By plantations, I mean here the pattern that emerged. There were no doubt precedents in ancient history, many of them in Rome and no doubt Greece and so on, but particularly from about the 16th, 17th centuries, whereby European nations, in their imperial expansion into other parts of the world, took a form of agricultural production to other nations and civilizations and imposed it on them. So the form that was taken was the very systematized and organized, almost industrial, through the division of labor, industrial production methods of Western agriculture, which was developed in Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, and so on, and taking them across to the production of necessary goods for the West in other parts of the world. The first obvious extensive examples were the sugar plantations in Jamaica and elsewhere, which my family was involved with from the very beginning. And there you used an extreme, disciplined kind of approach, which depended, as we know, infamously on the importation of slaves on a large extent, because it's a feature of most plantations that the labor is bound in some way. You work it extremely hard, you pay it very little or nothing if it's slavery, and that's how you make your profits. So plantations are based on the kind of factory production, but applied to plants rather than the production of goods in factories. And in order to do that, you have to almost enslave the labor force to make it do these things. And so the archetypal example was the sugar plantations. And then the Dutch and the Portuguese took plantations to other places, to rubber plantations in various places in the Pacific. And most interestingly to me, because my family was again involved with it, were the tea plantations of Assam, where my father was a tea plantation manager for 20 years. And so I was brought up on a plantation for a few months or a year or so before I came back to England. And there you had a muted form of the sugar plantations. That is, the labour was brought in from other parts of India because the Assamese didn't want to work in these fairly difficult conditions, very difficult, I mean, stressful labour indeed on a tea plantation. And so they brought in indentured labour. Indentured meant that they had their passage paid, they were paid a small sum of money in exchange for undertaking, a written undertaking that they would work for a certain number of years and not leave. So sometimes it's called bonded labour, sometimes indentured labour, and it's not slavery in the sense that you don't pass on this status to your children. It's not slavery in the classical sense that you are a non-person with no legal rights, but you are exactly like a servant, working as a servant in the great period of servanthood, say in England in the 17th, 18th centuries, when you would agree with a master for a year. They'd pay you a small sum, they'd look after your housing and your clothing and so on, and pay you a little bit at the end, and you would say, I will work for you for a year or 3 years. And so it was a form of servanthood, but in the case of the Indian bonded labour on the tea estates, it was much stronger. It was almost impossible to leave. The periods of indenture were much longer. The work inflicted on you was much more stressful than most servants in the West would have accepted. And this form of plantation then spread to Burma and much of the tropical world. It seems to be, particularly thinking about it, to be found along the tropical center of the world, where you can grow sugar or rubber or tea or things like that. It's less to be found in the northern parts of Europe and Russia, or right down in the south of Australia or anywhere like that. So it's a tropical form of industrial production and extremely effective, particularly for those who own the plantations, who made vast sums of money, and particularly effective for the imperial nations which benefited from the surpluses that these plantation workers created. The idea that this has gone, of course, is a delusion. It continues in all sorts of different ways now, but perhaps not so manifestly. And it is a great period of overwork, underpay, loss of liberty for millions and millions. And as someone who's been, whose family at least was deeply involved in two of these experiments, I can hardly look on it with any kindness or favour. But it's easy to judge. If I'd been born a generation earlier, like my father, like several of my uncles and great-uncles, I might well have ended up as the manager of some kind of plantation somewhere in the world, because you needed a job and to send your children to boarding schools, which is where the profits of my father's work went to educate me. So we're all implicated and bound up, and every time we drink a cup of tea or add sugar to our meals or put on our rubber tires, we have to remember the kind of labour and background that is probably producing that benefit for us.